Hello, I'm Greg Doran. I'm the Artistic Director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I'm joined this afternoon by two of the cast and the director of our 2015 production of Othello, ahead of tonight's broadcast on BBC4 at 9:30, and for a limited time on BBC iPlayer as part of Culture in Quarantine. I'm going to go around the group, asking you each to introduce yourselves and your role in the production. Hugh, do you want to go first?
Yep, with pleasure. My name is Hugh Quarshie. I played Othello in Othello.
Thank you. Lucian.
Hello, my name is Lucian Msamati, and I played Iago in Othello.
And my name's Iqbal, and I directed Othello.
Great, thank you very much. Well, look, I'm going to start by chucking you each a question to begin with. Sure. Hugh Quarshie has been a bit of a trailblazer at the RSC, but we're back to 1981 when I remember seeing you play Aaron in a crazy double bill of Two Gentlemen of Verona and Titus Andronicus. You've written eloquently about the role of Othello in the past. Did you have any reservations about playing him in this production?
Yes, you know I did.
It's a leading question.
Lucian very wisely opted to play Iago, and I don't think he has any intention ever of attempting Othello. And I know why. It is because when you consider that a play written 400 years ago by one white Englishman for another white Englishman who had blacked up to play in front of a predominantly white audience, it's unlikely that the actor playing Othello is going to be asking the kind of questions that a black actor would ask, and as to why he does this and why he does that. And it seemed to me that the odds were stacked against Othello, in the sense that, as you know, Iago has twice the number of soliloquies that Othello does, and the quality of Iago's soliloquies allow him to talk directly to an audience. It's very difficult for Othello to, as it were, play that confessional role to an audience. He appears to be talking to himself more than to an audience, or be talking to put out the light and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, he's talking to an object. Yeah. I really did try to wrench it so that I could address the audience in the soliloquies. But it just seemed to me that Shakespeare is much more interested in Iago than he is in Othello. And he has Othello make that leap from excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee, and when I love thee not, chaos is come again. In the same scene, 350 lines later, he's saying, now do I see it is true. Look here, Iago, all my fond love, thus do I blow to heaven. Now, it's difficult to understand why somebody who is as sage, as judicious, as magnanimous, as dignified, as noble, and as good a judge of character as he appears to be in the first part of the play, should, in a single scene, become this strange, uxoricidal, murderous, jealous wreck in the second part of the play, on the basis of a handkerchief and an allegation about a dream. So the play, our production, I think, covered up the faults of the play, and the play does have faults. Yeah. And we'll come to this later, but I think the play does have, should we say, some mild racist assumptions. I'll stop there for now.
That's good. But what's extraordinary is how credible you made it, having those reservations, and you did some very interesting things, which we'll perhaps come to. And of course, there's another element, I'm sure, not only the soliloquies and the distribution of those soliloquies, but most of Iago's in prose, most of Othello's in verse. There's a different relationship to the audience in some way. I don't know, I mean, how you found that. It's in a way, because Iago's language is so everyday, and there's a kind of charged, heightened quality to Othello's language. That has a different, plays differently with the audience too, I guess. But look, let me come to Lucian. I just would notice, Lucian, your Wikipedia page declares that you played Salad Orsan in Game of Thrones and are the first black actor to play Iago at the RSC, which is an interesting way of defining your career. So how did that come about, and how do you feel about
You know what? This was Iago is a gift. A gift.
Yeah.
But I think I think for me the delicious challenge was to make as difficult an Iago as possible, as a humanly credible an Iago as possible, and also I think we gained an incredible amount by having a black Iago and a black Othello. In terms of the idea of a brotherhood, of a kinship, or an assumed kinship, which I think played very, very wonderfully into what I believe wrongly in some instances is the racist elements that run through the play, which of course exist. But for me, it was always a question of going, well, in our version, in our iteration, Iago uses the biases inherent within the society that he's had to navigate his life through against his brother, not only in arms but also of color, who he believes has slighted him in quite a major way. And I would like to believe that we achieved that. I mean, it is very easy in some versions to play Iago as the cool puppet master who's got all the answers, who's got the audience in his pocket, which for an actor is again a delicious gift, a delicious meal. But I think we found with the trust of my two fine colleagues, trust and grace of my two fine colleagues, we found a humanity, the danger that exists in love between those who have served in combat and in that thing called jealousy, which I think both Iago and Othello suffer from quite deeply.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think that in a way, having both Iago and Othello black, it somehow made his kind of betrayal of Othello even greater. And Iki, let me come to you then. So what for you did having a black Iago and a black Othello do for the play?
Well, I mean, the guys have kind of set out what the issues were that we were discussing before we even got into a rehearsal room. I think if you're doing this play now, I think what we had to do was sort of address the performance history of this play. Because a lot of what Hugh's talking about is not just inherent in the text, it's the performance history of the piece. And what Lucian was talking about, us trying to avoid, was this puppet master person that just makes even more intense the humiliation that the actor playing Othello goes through. If basically he's constantly laughing with the audience and there's no jeopardy for Iago, then the experience of Othello, the descent of Othello is reduced, and his interiority, his psychological complexity is completely diminished. And what we were very keen to do, I think, was to take every opportunity to play the jeopardy and danger of the improvisations that Othello was enacting. We also, I think, were very careful to not assume that Iago's plan existed in full from the very beginning, that it developed, that there were a series of betrayals that pre-existed the action of the play, but also existed within the action of the play, that intensified his psychopathy, his strategy, his desire to break his brother, and there is love sewn into it. But there is also, as Lucian was saying, there is this, and you said it as well, Greg, just now, there is this assumption of two people being of a kind. And actually what's interesting about the world now, obviously, is that we're not. BAME is problematic in the extreme, that the world we live in assumes a kinship and assumes a kind of identity that people might not share. And these two black men were obviously very, very differently inscribed by the world. Hugh's Othello was the celebrity outsider, given enormous privilege in that world, but discovering that there are certain things that the executive that was still white in that world would not allow him to transgress. Whereas Lucian's Iago is the assimilated black man in some senses, the man that has played the game really well, but at the same time knows how he can use race as a means, as a weapon. He can subvert the white man, and he did that constantly throughout with Rodrigo, and sort of controlling him. And so very, very rich terrain to sort of navigate between the plays that exist and the performance history that we were dealing with.
I found that very, very potent in the production, because it felt to me as though Iago was the great improviser. He was bouncing on his tightrope, and when he says at the end, don't ask me why I did it, even though I kept on detecting the source of his being a psychopath. Whether, I don't know, Lucian, whether that famous phrase of Coleridge's about his motiveless malignity. Do you believe he lies in those asides? Does he actually think that Othello has slept with Emilia and possibly Cassio as well, or is it just a mishmash of mad improvisation?
It's very clear for me from the get-go what Iago's quarrel is with Othello, and I've never really understood the sort of the quasi-academic literary obsession with the motiveless malignancy. I was passed up for promotion, having served with distinction, and by the codes of conduct that we use, I should be next in line. And what happened is young, beautiful, Sandringham-educated, white establishment Michael Cassio gets the nod over me. Okay, I'll fix you, and I will show you. Now, what is interesting in my own study and exploration of it is that very, very often, even in my own experiences, speaking very personally and candidly, having gone through the horror of separation and the divorce, is that sometimes in the depth of the pain and in the depth of despair, in the depths of losing, in a sense, a foundation or an idea of what your place is within what is supposed to be the most secure social structure, or we assume to be the most assumed social structures. The mania that comes from that displacement sends your brain into the most extreme, emotional, ridiculous directions and assumptions. I think we as human beings, even now, as we watch the world turned upside down, as we watch all these extremes, some of people who we assume to be the most logical, to be the most sensible, to be the most compassionate, whatever their persuasion, are coming out with some of the most outrageously extreme justifications, accusations, theories on life, love, reality, that it beggars belief. And so for me, this is all of this love and jealousy, beware my lord of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster that mock the meat it feeds on. It messes us up. It really messes us up. So it makes a warped kind of sense, everything that he says. But I don't think it has ever been useful to dig too deeply into it for myself.
Yeah. You sense this great bout between these two heavyweights. And of course, Iago and Othello have 55% of the lines of the whole play. But of course, it's a quartet, really, isn't it? And you know, it would be really interesting just to hear some of your thoughts about the two women, Desdemona and Emilia, beautifully played by Joanna van der Haan and Aisha Darker. But that in a way, again, just as you were ripping shreds of tradition off the playing of Othello and Iago, those two women were never innocent victims of they didn't play their victimhood, did they? I mean, I thought it was very strong the way that you characterized those two women.
Well, one of the first things that I asked them to consider was there is nothing in the play that assumes a sisterhood between these two women. Emilia comes from a very different place in that world and class system, and so we thought we'd explore that and push that, and actually dramatize what I think is in the play, which is that her loyalty is to her husband. Now that is a difficult and problematic relationship, and what we discovered was that the gesture of stealing the handkerchief for Iago is a kind of an act of reclamation, trying to reclaim some kind of broken trust. And it's an awful moment in our production. It's a terribly moving moment where you realize there is something irredeemably broken here between these two people. So the journey of the two women in the piece is to get to a place where they can recognize each other, where they can view each other, where they can see each other's humanity, and they only arrive at that at the very final scene, in that beautifully moving scene in the kind of sacred pool, as it were, in our production. And again with Desdemona, it seemed to me that she shocks everyone in that first scene. She subverts all the stereotypes of the compliant young woman. I mean, she rejects the Duke's suggestion that she go and stay. She speaks out for herself, first of all. That's one thing. Secondly, when the Duke suggests flippantly that she could stay at her father's place after she's just betrayed him, she goes no, and then she says that I want to go to Cyprus with my husband, which is a shocking thing to suggest. And Othello is kind of backed into allowing her to do it. So we really enjoyed pushing that and just creating lots of different pockets of others in the piece, identifying people through class. So Cassio and Desdemona identified with each other through class and had a real ease, which again is something that Lucian's Iago can exploit so very easily if he needs to. And obviously someone like Desdemona isn't really seeing Iago or Emilia. There's a journey that she needs to go on. I mean, her worthiness is problematic in our production. We had two actresses that were really prepared to play those difficult notes, and it just complicated and enriched the two men, Othello and.
It seems to me that there really isn't much of a tragedy unless you want that relationship to work, the relationship between Othello and Desdemona. You have to see what she sees in him, and crucially, what he sees in her. And when I said earlier that Othello is a good enough judge of character, that's why he promotes Cassio, not Iago. But crucially, that's why he and Desdemona elope. For all that Brabantio has invited him to his house, he knows that Brabantio is just a closet racist and a liberal spouting, yeah, you know what I mean? So he knows that Brabantio is never going to give his blessing. That's why they're low. But so he sees in Desdemona, he has to see in Desdemona that freedom of spirit, that strength of mind, the boldness. And that's what draws them together. And that's what is lost in the course of the play. Critically, there's a scene that's known as the temptation scene. And remember, we agreed, I think it was my suggestion, that we set it in a chapel. And the crucifix was brought down in that scene. And that was the moment when Othello effectively recites the story of Job, had it pleased heaven to try me with affliction. And it's the sort of the last scene, the last chance he gives Desdemona to come clean. And Iago then comes in, and that's the point at which you wish, how can Iago persevere when he sees Desdemona in that state? And that's when you realize just how much of a psychopathic bastard Iago is. But the dropping in of the crucifix was critical in the sense that Othello is clearly a Christian. He as freely as to heaven I do confess the vices of my blood. Iago says, now were it for her to win them all, were it to renounce his baptism, all signs and seals of redeemed love. That Othello is what you might call what was called a Morisco, somebody who had converted possibly, or he might even have been born into Christianity, but Christianity is wrapped up in all the values that of Venice, and I think for him, in our telling of it, it was a rejection of that sense of having been, if you like, over-assimilated, having been brainwashed, having, if you like, become their serving nigger. How clever are the Venetians to send a black man to govern the olive population of Cyprus, and the fact that he feels conned,
Yeah.
Personally, I have a lot of sympathy with people who regard Christianity as just the insult that adds to the injury of slavery. Teaching slaves, to love, to follow the teachings of Jesus, when the slave owners had no intention of doing so. And I think there's something of that resonates today. Othello just, in his sense, coming to his senses at last, but realizing too late that he's been misled.
Yeah. Lucian, what about your relationship, Iago's relationship with Emilia, with Aishadarka's Emilia? Because that was a very strong, dangerous, volatile relationship.
Well, what I found, what I discovered, I mean, not only is Aisha is such a brilliant artist and such an open and warm and strong presence. And what struck me about her as a performer was that she was not intimidated at all. And so immediately when you step onto the stage with a performer who is that open and confident, it's suddenly a much more a freeing and more exciting game. But what it meant was, in terms of building the relationship between our Iago and Emilia, was that here was a woman, a wife, who loves this man. She genuinely loves him. I believe that there's been a tradition of readings or portrayals of the roles in where it is quite a disdainful, quite a mocking, sort of toxically patriarchal marriage, as it were. But what we discovered was that, well, taking the natural qualities of the performers and going, well, what if she does actually genuinely love him? And that again made it even harder for, I believe, for Iago to see through this horrible, dastardly plan. But then, at the same time, much like he is, they are both almost sort of bound by this doomed sense of duty and honor, either to the cause or to their specific roles, and ultimately to their love, or certainly in the case of Emilia, her love towards him. And that, I think, makes Iago even more broken and damaged.
It felt to me that the context of the design, Nikki, that Venice was very like Venice actually had a canal and a gondola, for God's sake. I remember the design meetings about that. But when you got to Cyprus, you felt the kind of pressure cooker. It's like the heat of that place somehow contributed to the intensity of what happens between that quartet of people. It really felt as though that contributed, but also the way that you created the sense of a garrison town, of a group of squaddies in an for them an alien environment. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, Venice was like a hyper real, representation of power now, and yes, we had our gondola. I didn't know that Lucian was so delicate about stepping into the gondola in the water. That was a negotiation and a half. His first lines, as he was let him manage that moment. He was very generous. But then, as you say, when we go to Cyprus, what was very important to us was that they were garrisoned in a place that seemed to be full of broken sacred structures, and not just Christian structures, but Islamic as well. There was this sense of these fractured systems of belief all around them, that they were in these ruins. And I mean, yes, as you say, I think it intensifies. The air loses breath. The water goes underground. It becomes subterranean, and as Hugh was saying earlier on, we had him descend into the subterranean depths, and then only at the very end do we get a coolness when Desdemona has a final moments with Emilia, a coolness and a sacred moment, simplicity that
terrible calm before the storm too.
Yeah, and also what was very important was that when Desdemona was first in Cyprus and playing around with Othello, she's playing around with objects that had just been used to torture someone, and that was a very potent way, I thought, for us to make the point that the chaos that Othello is wishing to escape has not been left behind. That it's all so fragilely balanced, dangerously balanced.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've almost run out of time, but actually something that came up earlier, this was you created this production 5 years ago. The world was quite different then. I mean, quite, in the light of current concerns, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, etc. Do you think the play will resonate tonight in a different way than it did in 2015? Should it? Does it? Might it?
Oh God, I hope it does. I hope it does. I'm sure Lucian and he will say that when we were first doing it and talking about it, there was this automatic response from certain people. So sort of saying the intervention that you make in terms of kind of changing the race of someone is just to make the most evil person in Shakespeare black, and so that's a problematic thing to do. But actually, the complexity of the interiority expressed of these two black men is, I think, extraordinary. I'm very, very proud of the detail that we were able to pour into it. And I'm very sad that the production doesn't exist for many other black actors to come into and to reinterpret, because the whole production set up multiple exchanges across these racial lines. It was not a black and white treatment of these things. Yeah. So I hope, unfortunately, that it will speak more potently, because we're in a heightened awareness of these things now than it did even 5 years ago. I don't know what you think, Lucian.
Hugh, any thoughts on Lucian?
I think I really do think that it will resonate, much more so in the sense that Venice, Cyprus, Othello, Iago, Michael Cassio, Desdemona, these are incredibly fragile alliances, and fragile alliances that exist in order to uphold the status quo.
Exactly.
But because the status quo in itself is fundamentally, chronically flawed, the characters are having to build bridges, break down the walls, write peace treaties, create a new language, all so that this flawed status quo can be upheld. When in actual fact, they should all be getting together to go, no, this is not working. None of it.
Mm.
Let us all, you know.
Yeah, again, having a black Iago address the issue of making that journey credible, that it was somehow more credible for Othello to believe a fellow black man. You know, there's the paradox of the production, in the sense that he felt a kind of solidarity with Iago, whereas Iago was, if anything, a borderline psychopath, suffering from borderline psychopathic personality disorder. He was a narcissist, and that, I think, does resonate today. That we've got this centrifugal force towards nationalism, towards patriotism, but away from solidarity, away from any sense of a shared humanity. And in that sense, I do think that the production will resonate. But certainly you know, today, when you have someone like, you've got the memory of Barack Obama as the most dignified president, followed by this buffoon, Donald Trump. And then you've got Kanye West embracing Donald Trump and say, he speaks for us, he represents us. And you think, wait a minute, Kanye, remind me, what color are you? How come you don't feel for the people who are flocking around the memory of George Floyd? As I think Lucian said a while ago, that there is a fracture. There is this mistaken notion of togetherness and of joint endeavor, shared endeavor. And that clearly is open to question now.
Can I say really briefly that the best example of this, I think, in our production is the drunk scene. Just look at the trajectory of that scene, which begins in joy and begins with Iago singing a song for the dead, that some in that audience will understand and will alienate others. But it begins in joy, and it begins in apparent racial harmony. And look how the fractures intrude. And I think just that whole section will speak potently to how fragile things are at the moment.
Well, gentlemen, I can't believe it, but we have run out of time, and there's so much more we could talk about. And thank you so much for your time and indeed for wonderful performances in what is a very powerful production. And I'm sure those of you who are going to go on and watch this will agree with me. A final reminder of the broadcast time: it's 9:30 tonight, Sunday, the 12th of July, on BBC4. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.